It looks to be about 2.
Yeah, I think we should get started. So I'll just introduce this video. Okay, I'll get started. Uh, this is an interesting video. The professor talks about manifest destiny, as you can see on the bottom, and he looks at how the natives were treated before, during, and after the Civil War. And it's very interesting, very well done. Anyway, I don't know if you, Senator Santorum, a former Senator Santorum from Pennsylvania, he got in trouble with CNN because he said when Europeans came to the United States, there was nothing here. There was a few savages, but that didn't count. He got in trouble, and they took him off he's no longer on CNN. So anyway, so I'll put this full screen and then get it started, and then it's about 30 minutes long, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
I don't think we can hear it, Paul.
What's that?
I don't think we can hear it.
Oh, you can't hear it?
No. I think you might have to reshare it.
I have to what?
Reshare your screen.
So what do I need to do?
Okay, so for starters, you'll have to get out of the full screen of the video.
Yeah, full screen, okay. All right.
And then I believe at the top of it, you'll see kind of like the green button for sharing. You'll just click on it again and bring that window out. And I think at the bottom, it'll say something like, I think it'll say share.
You press on screen sharing?
Yeah, share screen. It's the green button.
On the top?
Yes.
Although you are screen sharing, or just press on that? Okay.
And then once the window shows up that shows your screen, I think at the bottom it'll tell you to share your audio.
Oh.
And then once you click that, you just share your screen again.
Now try it again.
Yeah, just see if it works. Here, let me do this.
Okay.
Okay, try resharing your screen again.
Oh.
It should be at the bottom with the green button that says share screen.
Yeah.
And then you'll click that green button at Can anybody hear it?
No.
Okay. Let's try this again.
We can't hear it?
No. Okay, you'll have to click the green button again, and once that window shows up that lets you share your screen at the bottom left, it'll say it'll have a little option that says share sound. So you'll have to click that button and then share your screen.
Which one at the bottom?
Once you click the green share your screen button, it'll show up a window, and at the bottom left one it'll show share sound. Do you see it?
Now, what do I do again?
Okay,
Oh,
you'll have to reopen the sharing, the little options to share your screen. You'll have to reopen that section
on
again.
top?
Huh?
On top?
Yes, you'll have to click the green share screen button. And once it shows it opens the little box that lets you click from what screens to share. You'll have to go to the left bottom of that window and it should give you an option that says share sound and you'll have to click on it.
It is option for video.
Yeah. And then you just have to make sure to share your sound so that you can also hear that.
Yeah, share sound is there too.
Okay, make sure to click, make sure that it's
clicked
clicked on.
Again, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then you'll just have to share your screen. You'll have to click share again.
So, yeah, it keeps coming back.
There you go. Can everyone hear it?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
When I say the era of the American Civil War, what people, places, events, and issues do you think of first? Is it the concept of manifest destiny, or a map showing overland trails spreading like tentacles across the Trans-Mississippi West? Do you think about treaties tribal nations signed with the United States at places like Medicine Creek, Traverse des Sioux, and Fort Wise? Does your mind turn to images of people such as Leshai, Ta Oyate Duta, Henry Berry Lowry, or John Ross? Do the mass hanging of 38 Dakota men, the Sand Creek Massacre, or the Long Walk occur to you as pivotal events? My guess is probably not. The American Civil War casts a long shadow across the mid-19th century. Indeed, the period is typically defined by debates over slavery or freedom, secession or union. Accordingly, Mohawk scholar Scott Manning Stevens has asked, where are American Indians in the historiography of the Civil War? This lecture answers his question by exploring the meanings American Indians assigned to the years leading up to the war itself, and to the war's repercussions, to an era that might be better known as one of war's civil and otherwise. To begin, it's important to understand that the decades leading up to the American Civil War were, in fact, defined by competing visions of expansion. During the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, non-Native Americans divided over the question of whether the establishment of American empire in the West would include slavery. They weren't divided, however, over the question of whether the United States would expand its empire. And so, the controversies between North and South had everything to do with the West, and therefore with Native people and Native land. The pervasiveness of non-Native assumptions regarding expansion can be found in the idea of manifest destiny. Coined by newspaper columnist John O'Sullivan in 1845, it held that expansion was part of a providential mission in which civilization would triumph over savagery. If it was manifest or apparent that non-natives were destined to lay claim to the entire North American continent, then Native people had an equal and opposite destiny to be absorbed to the point of vanishing. Guided by notions of manifest destiny, westward expansion accelerated, and the United States became continental by the 1850s. The process involved the annexation of Texas, a treaty with Great Britain that led to the acquisition of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and a war with Mexico that ended with the U.S. in possession of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. During these years, the U.S. territorial land base expanded by 67%. The discovery of gold and silver in California, Nevada, and Colorado during the 1840s and 1850s drew more people into native homelands. And soon, overland trails were snaking across Indian country, bringing miners, ranchers, homesteaders, missionaries, and traders. Between 1840 and 1860, hundreds of thousands of non-natives made the trek into the West. The United States government used treaties with tribal nations to pave the way for this expansion. Treaties secured land cessions, extinguished Indian title, established forts and trading posts, and defined the boundaries of reservations. Treaties were also meant to serve as vehicles of assimilation through provisions that included training in the manual arts, farming, formal education, and Christianity. During the 1840s, and especially the 1850s, treaty making took place all across the northern and southern plains, the Pacific Northwest, the Great Basin, the Southwest, and California. Yet treaty making was attended more often than not by confusion, corruption, dissension, misunderstanding, conflict, and consequently, war. Some treaties, such as the 18 that were made with Indians in California during the early 1850s, were never even ratified by the Senate and therefore didn't carry the force of law. There are many important stories about how Native people dealt with the challenges posed by manifest destiny, the expansion of American empire, and treaty making during the 1840s and 1850s. The one I'd like to focus on for the next several minutes involves the Nisqually people in the Puget Sound region of present-day Washington. During the mid-19th century, the Puget Sound region was filled with a multitude of linguistically and culturally distinct indigenous nations. Among them were the Nisqually, a village-oriented, Salish-speaking people in South Puget Sound, who relied both on the rivers for fish and on the prairies for hunting and gathering. Indeed, the Nisqually consider themselves a salmon people, even as in Salish they are called people of the grass country. Between 1854 and 1855, Washington's territorial governor, Isaac Stevens, conducted a barn-burning, treaty-making campaign throughout the Pacific Northwest and Plateau. 11 hastily concluded treaties, forged in the context of huge multi-tribal councils, effectively ceded most of the land in the Pacific Northwest and Plateau to the United States. Along the banks of Medicine Creek in the Washington Territory on December 26, 1854, some 600 Nisqually, Puyallup, and Squaxin Island Indians met with a treaty commission headed by Washington's governor, Isaac Stevens. An arrogant man who looked at the recognition of tribal sovereignty as beneath the dignity of the United States, Stevens adopted bullying command and obey tactics during the treaty negotiations. This was an extension of his own belief in manifest destiny. Shortly after becoming territorial governor in 1853, for instance, he assured his non-Indian constituents that, quote, "an imperial domain will descend to your children in the cause of humanity and freedom." None of this created a context for successful diplomacy. Making matters worse, misunderstandings abounded. Many of them were a product of the reliance on what's called Chinook jargon during council. Chinook jargon is a 500-word trade language, and it was used during the negotiations despite the fact that it was far too rudimentary to convey the complex ideas that were being dealt with. Legal scholar Charles Wilkinson has rightfully asked, how could Chinook jargon possibly speak to sovereignty, land ownership, fishing rights, assimilation, freedom, or the futures of societies? In short, it couldn't. The hubris, bullying tactics, and inadequacy of Chinook jargon combined to form a very dangerous situation for the Nisqually and the other tribes in attendance. Making matters worse, Stevens influenced the selection of who would represent them at the council, and it wasn't at all clear whether they understood what they were agreeing to. Nonetheless, through the Treaty of Medicine Creek, Native people lost approximately 2.2 million acres, including vitally important fishing sites and prairie lands. The Nisqually were left with only a small 1,280-acre reservation on thickly wooded land with no access to fresh water or the prairies. Forcing a salmon and prairie people onto 2 square miles atop a wooded bluff was cruel, and it's hard to imagine anyone letting that stand. Leshai, a respected Nisqually headman, initially followed the path of accommodating the presence of non-native newcomers, and he was among the leaders chosen by Stevens to represent the Nisqually at the Treaty of Medicine Creek. Although there is an X on the treaty that purportedly indicates his assent, Nisqually oral tradition holds that Leshai didn't sign it. Indeed, he refused to acknowledge the terms of the treaty, taking particular issue with being forced to remove to the small reservation identified in it. What's more, Leshai apparently threatened war if Stevens wouldn't renegotiate, and he left the treaty grounds before the signing took place. The X, then, is suspected to have been forged. Making matters worse, the Nisqually were also prevented from exercising terms of the treaty that had been agreed to, such as the right to hunt, gather, and fish at what were called all usual and accustomed grounds and stations, in common with all citizens of the territory. Conflict over these reserved rights, in fact, continued well into the 20th century. Tensions grew in the months after the parley at Medicine Creek and erupted in war in late 1855, when a party of militiamen traveling through Nisqually land was ambushed and 2 of them were killed. An eyewitness claimed Leshai took the life of one of them. The fighting reached a climax in March 1856, leaving the Nisqually defeated. In the span of 4 days in November of that same year, Leshai was brought into custody, tried in a civilian court, and found guilty of murder. Despite his insistence that he wasn't present at the skirmish that led to the death of the 2 militiamen the year before, Leshai was executed by hanging on February 19, 1858. The Nisqually were not, however, completely without redress. Article 6 of the Medicine Creek Treaty allowed for a replacement reservation, which they secured in January 1857. It provided for some 4,700 acres straddling the Nisqually River, and it allowed them to continue a way of life that would otherwise have been virtually impossible. And then, in 2004, a historical court of justice, a symbolic tribunal convened in Tacoma, Washington, reviewed the evidence used to convict Leshai and exonerated him. The Nisqually provide a different perspective on the 1840s and 1850s, the antebellum years that are too often seen only through the lens of sectional crisis. The case study also demonstrates the consequences of the North and South's shared vision of establishing American empire in the West. So how does attending to the experiences of Native people change the way we think about the Civil War years themselves? First of all, some 20,000 American Indians enlisted in either the Union or the Confederate armies between 1861 and 1865. This included Ojibways and Odawas in the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters, Oneidas and Stockbridge Munsees in the 37th Wisconsin Volunteers, Iroquois in the Tuscarora Company of the 123rd New York Volunteers, as well as Sac and Fox and Omaha Scouts and Pequots and Mohegans from Connecticut, who were enrolled in so-called colored regiments. In the Carolinas, the Catawba and Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians served as soldiers of the Confederacy. They did so strategically, as a means of protecting their own rights, sovereignty, and territory, and not for any love of the Confederate States of America. In contrast, the Lumbee Henry Berry Lowry lashed out at white supremacy in Robeson County, North Carolina, when they tried to force the Lumbee to serve the Confederacy during the Civil War. By the 1850s, the General Assembly of North Carolina categorized citizenship by race and voided marriages between whites and free persons of color back to the third generation. Both of these policies disenfranchised Native people, including the Lumbee. That didn't stop the state government from conscripting Lumbees during the Civil War. In 1861, some of them were shipped off to build a coastal fort at Wilmington, North Carolina, where they suffered from malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery. Back home, the Lumbee endured violence directed at them by North Carolina's Home Guard, a militia-like force that consisted of able-bodied white males who had been exempted from serving in the Confederate Army. In January 1865, the Lumbee Henry Berry Lowry returned violence for violence. And as Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's army prepared to move across the Lumber River, the Lumbee assisted Union soldiers who had escaped from Confederate prisons. In March 1865, Henry Berry Lowry's father and brother were murdered by the Home Guard, supposedly for deserting their duties at the fort in Wilmington. Lowry, in turn, organized a band that took revenge on the murderers. The raids Henry Berry Lowry carried out with his kin, and sometimes with the escaped Union soldiers, culminated in a 7-year war against white supremacy, and it made him a legend. Although he disappeared in 1872, Lowry continues to be a symbol of Lumbee resistance and persistence to this day. The Cherokee, who had been forcibly removed from the Southeast to the Indian Territory during the 1830s, experienced the Civil War quite differently. For them, it contributed to a civil war all their own. For the Confederacy, the Indian Territory was important for its resources. The farms, plantations, and ranches, for instance, provided beef, hides, horses, and grain. Furthermore, the Confederacy hoped the Cherokee, Seminole, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations would provide troops to defend its far western borders. But why should Indian people fight on either side, especially Southern Indians, for the Confederacy? It seems to make little sense, given how badly they had been treated during the removal crisis of the early 19th century. Well, for one thing, much Cherokee animosity was directed against the former Indian fighter and president, Andrew Jackson, now 20 years dead, and the federal government he had led. It was the United States that had forged treaties with the Cherokee through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, only to violate them all with the fraudulent Treaty of New Echota in 1835. It was also the U.S. federal government that failed to provide adequate food, shelter, and transportation during the forced removal of the Cherokee to Indian Territory during the 1830s, which contributed to the loss of a quarter of their population. Moreover, the Northern Free Soil and later Republican parties advocated for Western expansion without slavery, and they had Indian Territory in mind as a source of land. And finally, many Southern Indians had adopted Southern cultural ways of life, including ownership of African American slaves. As a result, the Cherokee divided internally over the question of whether to ally with the Union, with the Confederacy, or to remain neutral. Principal Chief John Ross, who had guided the Cherokee Nation through the removal crisis and the difficult period of rebuilding the nation that followed, initially advocated for neutrality. He believed nothing could be gained from becoming involved in the war. After the Union abandoned their forts in the Indian Territory in 1861, however, Ross concluded a treaty with the Confederacy, and the Cherokee National Council issued a formal declaration of war against the United States in October of that year. The tide, however, soon turned. In March 1862, the Union defeated a Confederate force supported by a large Cherokee contingent at the Battle of Pea Ridge in northwest Arkansas. A few months later, Ross, who switched his allegiance once more to the Union, was arrested in his home by members of the 6th Kansas Cavalry. Ross and his family then went into exile, first in Kansas and Delaware after that. Meanwhile, Stand Watie, a member of the pro-removal faction during the 1830s and a perennial foe of John Ross, became the principal chief of the pro-Confederate government in August 1862. Commanding the Cherokee Mounted Rifles, Watie commenced a bloody civil war within the Cherokee Nation that saw the burning of the Capitol buildings at Tahlequah and John Ross's home at Park Hill. Watie went on to secure the rank of Brigadier General in the Confederate Army and was the last Confederate general to lay down arms in June 1865. Needless to say, the Civil War proved tremendously consequential for the Cherokee Nation. Speaking to the devastation brought by the war, historian R. David Edmonds notes that by 1865, 1/3 of all Cherokee wives were widows, and 1/4 of Cherokee children were orphaned. Moreover, Cherokees, even with John Ross restored as principal chief, faced a punitive peace in the Treaty of 1866 with the United States. The treaty included land cessions, the forced acceptance of railroad rights-of-way through their nation, the emancipation and enfranchisement of their former slaves, known as freedmen, and the relocation of other tribal communities within their lands. Like the Cherokee, native people in Minnesota, Colorado, and Arizona, as well as New Mexico, engaged in wars that were at once separate from and intertwined with the American Civil War. The Dakota, the easternmost division of the Sioux, consists of 4 tribes: the Mdewakanton, Sisseton, Wahpeton, and Wapakute. Their homelands were located in what is today southwestern Minnesota, and from August through September 1862, these homelands became a battlefield. At the heart of what is called the Dakota conflict were gross violations of the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota. Originally signed in 1851, they included land cessions, the establishment of a reservation along the Minnesota River, and the guarantee of annuities in cash and food. Congress, before ratifying these treaties, struck from them the guarantee of reservation lands. White settlers soon encroached, and the Dakota grew dependent on predatory traders. Indeed, after the traders collected what they were owed, there was often nothing left of the cash payments the treaties provided for. Not only that, but the annual federal appropriations were often late. The promised food didn't arrive, and when it did, it was frequently spoiled. The presence of assimilation-minded missionaries and inept government agents further deepened the crisis, and the Dakota became polarized. All of this led the Dakota back to the treaty table in 1858. There, they were forced to accept yet another land cession for which they were not paid fair market value. And once again, unscrupulous traders laid claim to monies owed to them. By 1862, the Dakota had fallen into abject poverty, starvation, and dependence. Traders refused to extend credit. One of them, Andrew Myrick, went so far as to say that as far as he was concerned, the Dakota could eat grass or their own dung. Tensions climaxed in August 1862. Fighting raged for 2 months, leaving hundreds of soldiers, white civilians, and Dakota people dead. Andrew Myrick was among the early casualties. He was found with his mouth stuffed with grass.
Good.
The tide was turned in favor of the United States when President Abraham Lincoln charged General John Pope, embittered by his recent defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, to deliver a decisive blow to the Dakota, which he did at the Battle of Wood Lake in late September 1862. The fallout from the Dakota conflict was as horrific as the battles themselves. After 1,200 Dakota men, women, and children were taken prisoner, some 800 Dakota warriors surrendered. 303 Dakotas were swiftly sentenced to death for crimes ranging from rape to murder in a farcical mass trial in the fall of 1862. President Lincoln, however, intervened and commuted many of their sentences. Nonetheless, the man remembered as the great emancipator for his role in abolishing slavery signed the order condemning 38 Dakota men to be hanged in the largest mass execution in United States history. Treated as a spectacle, some 3,000 people gathered in Mankato, Minnesota, to watch it happen on December 26, 1862. Another 326 Dakotas were imprisoned for 3 years in Davenport, Iowa, where more than 1/3 of them died. Jerome Big Eagle, a Mitawankaton chief, provides an important window on the injustice of their imprisonment. Initially, he sought to accommodate non-Indians, he recalled. Ultimately, though, he felt compelled to go to war. He rejected the idea that he had committed any crimes. Big Eagle remembered, "If I had known that I would be sent to a penitentiary, I would not have surrendered. I had not been a murderer or present when a murder had been committed, and if I had killed or wounded a man, it had been in a fair, open fight." Another 1,700 Dakota men, women, and children were imprisoned, not in a penitentiary, but at Minnesota's Fort Snelling, and were forcibly removed the following spring to the Crow Creek Reservation in South Dakota. Others, still later, were removed to the Santee Sioux Reservation in Nebraska. Another reluctant leader of the Dakota conflict was a Mitawankaton chief named Ta-Oyate-Duta, meaning his Red Nation, though he's commonly known as Little Crow. After the Battle of Wood Lake, Ta-Oyate-Duta fled to Canada and eventually made his way back to Minnesota along with his son, only to be shot and killed while picking raspberries in July 1863. The farmer who did it promptly collected a $500 reward. Little Crow's scalp and skull were publicly displayed in the Minnesota State Capitol until 1918, when his grandson requested that it be removed. Not until 1971 were his remains returned to the Dakota people for reburial. These were the macabre consequences of manifest destiny and the foundation for very different memories of a most uncivil war. Indeed, Dakota scholar Angela Wilson summarizes the Dakota conflict this way, quote, "The loss associated with that seminal event has affected every Dakota alive since 1862, and it will continue to affect every Dakota person in the future." The Sand Creek Massacre in late November 1864 served a similar dark purpose for the Cheyenne and Arapaho in the High Plains. The discovery of gold along the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado in 1858 brought with it a tidal wave of non-Indian settlers. It didn't take long for conflict to erupt, especially as non-natives encroached upon land that was set aside for the Cheyenne and Arapaho through the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. By 1861, through the subsequent Treaty of Fort Wise, the Cheyenne and Arapaho had their lands reduced to a useless parcel called the Sand Creek Reserve near Fort Lyon, Colorado. Within a few years, Cheyenne warriors known as Dog Soldiers lashed out at the non-native invaders. They did so with the conviction that they had not consented to the treaty and therefore weren't beholden to it. In the late fall of 1864, a Cheyenne leader named Black Kettle moved his band back to Sand Creek. By moving to the reserve and distancing themselves from the Dog Soldiers, They had every right to believe that they would avoid getting caught in the ongoing hostilities. Black Kettle even raised an American flag overhead, along with a white flag to signify peace and friendship. Nonetheless, Colonel John Chivington, a Methodist minister and Civil War veteran with political aspirations, led the 3rd Colorado Cavalry on an attack of Black Kettle's camp on November 29, 1864. 900 soldiers proceeded to cut Black Kettle's band to pieces. Some 270 people, men, women, and children, were massacred. Little Bear, a Cheyenne survivor, recalled, "I seen lots of women and children that had been killed. After the fight was over, I seen 2 or 3 soldiers standing over the dead, I suppose scalping them." The local newspapers celebrated scenes such as this as evidence of a great victory. "Colorado soldiers have again covered themselves with glory," one editorial proclaimed. The city of Denver even hosted celebratory parades. Historian Robert Utley wrote, "Theater patrons applauded the display of Cheyenne scalps, some of them of women's pubic hair, strung across the stage at intermission." Black Kettle survived, and he chose the path of accommodation and treaty making once more, moving his people into Oklahoma Territory, only to be butchered by General George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry at the Washita River 4 years later. What transpired in Minnesota and Colorado weren't the only uncivil wars that occurred during the American Civil War. In the Southwest, the Dene, or Navajo, also fought to preserve their homeland and way of life. To stabilize the New Mexico Territory, consisting of present-day Arizona and New Mexico, and to stymie Confederate incursions, the United States set out to force the Dene to accept a reservation away from their ancestral lands. In 1863 and 1864, Kit Carson, another veteran of the Civil War, conducted a campaign of total war against the Dene, destroying their sheep, their fruit orchards and fields, and their very homes. A brutal invasion of the Dene stronghold in Canyon de Chelly in the summer of 1863 brought the Dene to the brink of starvation and compelled them to surrender. And by 1864, the U.S. military inaugurated a massive forced march to an internment camp in a barren land called Bosque Redondo, near Fort Sumner, New Mexico. In a succession of waves between 1864 and 1868, approximately 8,000 Dene made the 400-mile march. This forced removal has come to be known as the Long Walk, and it claimed the lives of more than 200 men, women, and children. At Bosque Redondo, the Dene endured malnutrition, disease, bad water, and drought. Government supplies often turned out to be spoiled, and the Comanche and Kiowa raided them at will. And yet the Dene held fast and fought back, securing a treaty in 1868 that allowed them to return to their homelands. The people still remember those dark years with pain and bitterness. Dene historian Jennifer Nez Danetdale writes of this ordeal. And yet, even as they mourn, she adds, they celebrate the courage and resilience of their grandmothers and grandfathers. This quote gets to the heart of the many meanings American Indians assigned to the years leading up to the Civil War, to the war itself, and to the war's repercussions, an era powerfully shaped by competing visions of how to construct an empire in the West, an era of wars, civil and otherwise, that was only beginning.
Anyway, that's the, how can I get back to
I think you're back, Paul.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, I got to get rid of.
We see you just fine, Paul.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm trying to get it full. Oh, here. Okay. Hey. How do I get back to screen? Sarah, are you there?
Yeah, what are you having an issue with?
I just want to get back to, so I can see everybody.
Oh, it'll probably be towards the bottom. You'll probably see the Zoom icon. Which it's like the little blue icon with the white camcorder, I guess. You would probably just click on that.
Oh, okay. There it comes. All right.
Can you see everybody now?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, there we got a fair number of participants. Good. Anyway, I wanted to talk about, I grew up in southern Minnesota where they hung those Indians, and the farm was only about 15. My father's farm I grew up on about 15 miles north of Mankato. And I remember when I was young, my father used to go there for business, and they used to have a monument where they hung those Indians. But then after a while, they got rid of it for obvious reasons. And my great grandfather settled in southern Minnesota on the farm south of where I grew up in 1858. So he was there in 1862 when all these when the Indians caused all kinds of trouble. So anyway, our family had some experience with that incident in southern Minnesota. But I found this video very interesting. Just think about what's happening in Israel and with the Palestinians who have no power whatsoever. We did the same thing with our Native Americans from the standpoint of in the name of manifest destiny. So anyone else have a point they wanted to make? Any comments?
Paul,
Yeah.
as a kid growing up, I grew up in the South and I knew about several tribes. And of course, with all the things that were presented on TV and so forth, it seemed like there were just several tribes, main tribes across the country. Well, I heard or I saw an interview recently. There are 500 tribes that are currently part of the the government's treatment of Indians.
Uh-huh.
And I just saw an interview with a guy, I wish I knew his name. It was on I think it was PBS. And what he wants to do is return all of the lands to their prior and this includes our national parks. I don't know if you saw that.
Uh-huh.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. I think that would be difficult.
Yep. Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, it's not my mother taught in elementary school during that time, and after I got older and I learned about this, actually it was when I was going to college, and I said, did you ever teach your students about, that history? No, I wasn't supposed to. It wasn't in my curriculum.
Yep.
I mean, we've never been taught in our school about this history. So anyone else want to make a comment? Anyone?
Paul, I have a comment. Again, this just kind of tugs at my heartstrings. It just, I have many friends who are natives from different tribes in New Mexico and elsewhere. And I've heard some of their stories and I just cannot believe what we as a people have done to them. But I found it extremely factual, interesting, but extremely sad. So it was a good program, Paul. Thank you, but it hurts.
Oh, me too, because until relatively recently, quite frankly, I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. I knew about it some, but until, and then I had done some ancestry work on my family, and I did a book, and that's when I started looking into it. And the extent to which we have just wiped them out like they were nothing, just embarrassing.
Yeah.
Anyway. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Well, and it continues to this very day. We've got a large segment of the Republican Party now who are pushing back mightily on any efforts to teach a true American history.
Correct.
Yeah,
And
that's exactly right.
And they define it as teaching our children to hate their own country, which is nothing to be more harmful to the national psyche than that kind of an attitude. And this is something that all of us have got to make sure that we do everything we can to prevent school board members who support that kind of thinking and local representatives, national representatives, up and down the line from being elected. Our own Yvette Harrell was one of 63 Republicans who voted recently against the anti-Asian hate legislation. And I think that I sent her a letter yesterday, and I encourage everybody to go to her site and send her an email and ask her what possible justification there can be for that. But it's just across the board where the white supremacists who are taking control of this country are doing everything they can to erase and whitewash the history of oppression that we have foisted on all peoples who are not like us.
Yeah, absolutely true.
Yeah.
I
heard a lot of us.
Go ahead, Jen.
A lot of us were laughing and scoffing at the idea of returning the land to our indigenous peoples. And I think that we need to look at it more closely and more seriously. It is not a laughing matter. It is called reparations. We owe reparations to Mexicans. We owe reparations to Blacks. We owe reparations to just about everybody that we've ever tried to dominate. And what form reparations will take, we need to start seriously talking about it. Not just, oh, well, they want that. We need to take it seriously.
Yeah, I agree.
Discussion on a roundtable might be interesting, might be useful.
If I can just say something, actually, because I know you guys mentioned like the whitewashing. So I'm originally from El Paso, got Texas education, and I reflect on like what I was taught in high school and middle school, and yeah, it really is very much whitewashed. And it's kind of really disturbing that it's never talked about, because growing up, I was kind of raised to demonize like, Mexicans' roles in like Texan history. And I kind of look back at it now with like more research, and it's kind of like weirdly messed up to have been taught things like that.
I grew up in Wisconsin, and there's several tribes in that area.
Yeah.
they typically weren't allowed to go to, at least at the time I was growing up, they weren't allowed to go to the public schools. They had the reservation schools. And it was very inadequate education. Oftentimes, because they're on reservations, their diets were, sparse. And to my knowledge, that's still going on today. I mean, they have what I think they're called Indian something that liaisons back to Washington. But there's so much greed and corruption in that line of moving money from Washington to the tribes that very little really gets to the tribes.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah, I
interested
had
in
Jerry
seeing-
Smith on not that long ago, and he's here in town, and he belongs to a Pueblo, and he just feels that the Pueblo have been put down so much and become so dependent on white people for their well-being, they've lost their identity and their self-sustaining abilities, totally. And I don't know if you remember that time I had him on, Jerry Smith. And anyone else?
I'm interested in seeing what kind of changes Deb Holland is able to bring about.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, we've got a great advocate there. Yeah. I would just
Jeff
like-
Holland. Who is he? Go ahead,
Jack.
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 He's Secretary of the Interior.
If you read the Sun News last Tuesday, our school board voted to make the curriculum more inclusive and include some of the history that had been excluded. However, it was done against the criticism of a lot of people who made statements, as David mentioned, that we're teaching our kids to hate their own country, but it did prevail. However, there is a school board election coming up in November, and I know there are two far right-wing people who are seeking positions on the school board. So I think it behooves all of us to see that there's a progressive candidates in those positions and support them.
Yeah, I saw in the paper that the school board agreed with the idea of more variety in the education, but right-wing people really pushed back very hard.
Yes.
Paul, can I speak up?
Yeah, Rosemary.
I went to the school board meeting last week and it was so contentious, and I can't tell you how disappointed I was to see what was going on in that conference room. What we see on television, what we read about, what is on the news is exactly what was happening. It became so contentious and I couldn't believe what they were saying. Thankfully, school board, it was a unanimous vote, and the inclusion, all of that, thankfully, but so true. I think it was Jack that said, or someone said, they know of maybe two other people that might step up and run who are considered right-wing. We really have to be careful with that and step up and become involved and work for those candidates that we know will be inclusive and be advocates for the children. But being at the school board meeting was a very sad moment for Las Cruces. It was
the paper implied that too.
Yeah, it was unbelievable.
They in the news.
I'm gonna have to, Paul, I'm gonna have to take off, but I just wanted to share one little item with the group. About 40 years ago, I had to go to a conference in Washington, DC, and I was with 3 other natives, and we all decided to go on one of these trolley tours to see the sites and the monuments. We were all having a really fun time. And then the trolley driver, who was our tour guide, pointed out the monument where Christopher Columbus is at and how he discovered America. And I turned to look at my friends. One was Navajo, one was Zuni, and one was Laguna Acoma. Those were their tribes. And I have never seen such sadness from an individual. And at that point, I swore I would become involved and be so respectful and love our natives because of what we have done to them. But that was a moment in my time that changed my life about how I approach when you work or you're with one of these natives. And with that, I'm going to have to go. Great program, Paul. We'll see y'all later. Bye, guys.
Okay,
Hi,
thanks,
Rosemary.
Rosemary. Thank you. Well, anyway, unless there's some other comments, anybody else? Yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm very ignorant of a lot of this stuff. Do you know what justification was given for manifest destiny? I understand that the term says it's just is, but was there any justification given?
Well, I don't know myself. All I know is that once we had the revolution and so forth, and after that, we just had the idea that we were going to go west. We didn't give a darn who was going to be there. They weren't going to stop us from going in there.
Rod has the
Rod has his hand up.
The answer is in the term. Manifest destiny. It's the will of God
Yeah,
that the white Anglo-Saxon race is supreme.
yeah. And it's still there today.
Yeah, just think about racism in this country. I mean, it's just ubiquitous.
Yeah. It truly, truly is, it's sad. Well, anyway, I just, now not going to have a roundtable next week. It's Memorial Day weekend. But first week in June, Gregory Smith, who is the director of the Doniana Community Art Council, he's going to talk to us about what they're doing and creating opportunity for more art in our community. I think it should be an interesting program. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great one.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Aye.
Bye.